Support comes from St. Louis Public Library Foundation, helping the library serve children and their families with programs and services needed to become lifelong readers. More information about the foundation is at slpl.org.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. The Trump administration last week, according to several media outlets, ordered some National Park Service sites across the country to take down materials related to slavery and Native Americans. The move stemmed from Trump's Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History executive order in March, which said materials should not inappropriately disparage Americans past or living and, quote, instead focus on the greatness of the achievement and progress of the American people. There haven't yet been noticeable changes to Gateway Arch National Park. We'll talk about that more a little later in the show. First, we want to bring you highlights from a conversation on this show in February 2023 about how Black history is presented. I was joined by Vivian Gibson, author of the award-winning and truly memorable memoir, The Last Children of Mill Creek, Pam Sanfilippo, Program Manager of Museum Services and Interpretation at the Gateway Arch National Park, and Cicely Hunter, Public Historian for the African American History Initiative at the Missouri Historical Society. I first asked Cicely about what it means to interpret history.
Yes, so I see interpreting history, especially as it pertains to Black experiences, is one in which we sometimes have to read against the archive. And so by that, I mean that, oftentimes these histories about Black people have been told from white perspective or perspective that's not necessarily Black people. And when that happens, a lot of times we have to read against that narrative that puts us as a subjected people and things of that nature, to really craft a story of lived experience that is indicative of Black people, that is, of course, about, things like the Black freedom struggle, but also about Black joy and Black experiences. And I think that's what's most important about interpreting history, is that we got to be more strategic in our emphasis that looks not just from the dominant narrative, but looks truly at Black life.
Mm-hmm. So it's looking at what is present and what is also then absent, not because it wasn't there, but because there wasn't attention being paid to it. Would you say that?
Exactly.
So, Vivian, the historical interpretation process sounds a lot like, collecting pieces of a puzzle that have been scattered all over the place in an effort to create sort of a clear picture of people in a place at a certain time. And an obvious example might be to look at newspaper clippings and relying on those, which present something and not a lot of other things, as you've mentioned, Cicely. And it shows perhaps a skewed side of the story. As you were writing your memoir about your childhood home of Mill Creek Valley, which was an historically Black neighborhood here in St. Louis that was razed in 1959 for, quote, industrial redevelopment, how did you find those pieces of history to complete your book?
That's a good question because, as Cicely pointed out, there wasn't always good information, say, in the newspapers or even in the museum archives or libraries. It was simply left out. And even today in newspaper.com, to get articles, you can't find Black newspapers, which amazes me today. And in pictorials for even at the History Museum, you don't always find pictures of Black life, or certainly not Black joy. If you put in Mill Creek, you find houses that have been demolished once things were starting to be torn down, but you can't find a neighborhood when we've been described as a slum. Mm-hmm. And all the pictures that you see are of that. Fortunately, it was a memoir and I had some of my family information. But I was 10 years old when Mill Creek was demolished. So I had to do a lot of research about what was going on in society at that time, and certainly in Mill Creek. And it was not easy.
And where did you do that research?
I did a lot of it at the History Museum. I did a lot of articles from the Post-Dispatch and the Globe Democrat and the St. Louis Star. But I had to read that because it was skewed. So a lot of that, and then of course the black newspapers, just history, period, about what was going on with urban renewal at the time, politics in the city, in the nation, that sort of thing. So.
Now, Pam, you are at the Gateway Arch National Park, and that is a form of official history, and it's part of an institution. There's this saying that is attributed to Winston Churchill, that history is written by the victors. Do you find that to be true in the kind of history that you have been sort of responsible for helping to interpret and to present, particularly at the Gateway Arch site?
I think historically that would be true as far as the traditional records that researchers looked at. What we've been able to do is kind of delve a little further, and that it's going on across the nation, of course, in museums and history departments throughout the country, to really things that were there before. What can census records tell us about where people were living, what their incomes were, more about them. And so using oral histories, which traditionally were not used as official records, and blending all of those together, and then going to the actual people who lived that history to tell those stories as well.
Cicely, if we put things sort of in another way, whose versions of Black history have had the most purchase in this country?
Yeah, so I of course like to point to Black scholars and folks who have lived the experience, because I think that that's truly where the real stories come in, and that's what shapes our understanding in a full and complete way. So, I go back to some books that I read from the 60s. Like, it's kind of crazy where I'm thinking about, like the civil rights movement with MLK, and how, at one point in time, there was even talk about, well, they're just aimless crowds kind of wandering, right? But they weren't. They were very organized and strategic. And this organization stretched back for, hundreds and thousands of years, right? Mm-hmm. And so just thinking about that, and coming to the understanding that there are scholars that have been doing this work and continue to do the work. And there are people who have lived the history and can tell the story in profound ways.
Now, one of the things that we did do before this conversation happening was some engagement. And our producer, Maya Norfleet, she posed a question to our online audience. Who taught you Black history? Where did you learn Black history? And when did you first start learning about Black history? So I am not someone who is from St. Louis. I was born and raised in Canada. So I didn't get much even about First Nations history when I was growing up through the 80s. One of the people who did respond to that call for engagement is someone who did grow up in Missouri. This person was a guest on our program previously, Marie Enger, and they shared that their mom, who is a history teacher, got them started as a child and got a little Black history in primary school. And they tweeted, quote, "I learned what I know now from the people around me and how to research what I didn't know from activists, that is, both online and in real life. And if not from my friends, colleagues, and community, I'd be stuck with a 7th grade Black history education." Again, that's coming from Marie Enger on Twitter. Cicely, in hearing that, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, so I when you read that quote, I think what I immediately went to is that, when we talk about American history, U.S. history, I really think it is Black history. In so many ways, I think that people think of them as disjointed, but they're very much interwoven and interconnected. And that's the power of Black experience and Black history, is that these things are not separated. They're not, they're not divorced, right? But they're integral and they're interconnected, interwoven. All of those things that are complex speak to Black experience, Black life, and alike. So that's just kind of what comes to mind for me.
So Pam, the museum at the Gateway Arch saw some recent renovations that were unveiled in 2018. And there's been also the renovation of the Old Courthouse. Now, can you provide a concrete example of a piece of history that is going to be interpreted differently with this Old Courthouse renovation?
Sure. The Park Service, part of the reason that the Old Courthouse is part of Gateway Arch National Park is because of the story of Dred and Harriet Scott. And at that time, it was just Dred Scott who was important in 1935. So we've told that story for many years. But with these new exhibits, we'll have an entire gallery dedicated to the story of Dred and Harriet Scott, including both of them and their family. But the emphasis is changing in that we're telling it more from their perspective. Previously, the Park Service would tell the story from the court cases as they came and the decisions that were made by the judges. Now we're looking at, their lives, how they met and got married, and then their experiences, and them making this decision to file the suit. So just, enriching that story, as Cicely was saying, looking at the people themselves.
What stories about everyday life will be provided to offer another interpretation and understanding of history?
Sure. Across from this gallery dedicated to Dred and Harriet Scott, we'll have a gallery called Pathways to Freedom that talks about African American life in St. Louis from its founding. And so, helping people understand that until post-Civil War, really, African Americans and whites were integrated in the communities. There are many reasons for that, but it wasn't until after that, after Reconstruction, that you start seeing the segregated communities. So again, how did we get here today?
Yeah, and that reminds me also, Cicely, of what you were saying about American history is Black history. So the separation of the two is something that has to be done with intention.
Yes.
And then also recognizing Black history also needs to be done with some intention, right? Vivian, St. Louis has a new Major League Soccer club, and St. Louis SC has announced plans to build various public art installations and memorials that are dedicated to Mill Creek Valley, and that's along the 1 mile of the Brick Line Green, which stretches from Harris Stowe State University going east to the St. Louis SC Stadium. Are plans like this part of what you were hoping for when you wrote your book? And that is to have larger institutions finally recognize what happened to Mill Creek Valley and honor its legacy?
I can honestly say that that's what I was hoping for. I was hoping to humanize the people in Mill Creek, to tell the story of everyday people and what our community was about. But certainly having a monument or monuments that are going to stretch this distance starts a conversation. And I think that's important. Segregating and displacing 20,000 people and putting up a monument 60 years later, that's a little bit of an imbalance. But if it starts a conversation, if children who come there ask questions about how did this happen, where are these people, where did they go, how did they end up here, it's a start.
Yeah. Is there some more work that you would like to see done, Vivian?
Absolutely. This is the first conversations I've ever heard about Mill Creek so publicly. I don't know if it was the timing with COVID, the book coming out, and people having time to read and discuss and reflect. But we have a long way to go. And certainly young people are going to be the answer to making the change, and they can't make changes if they don't know the history.
I want to ask a more personal question. What is it about history that interests you? So, Pam, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I consider myself more of a social cultural historian. I am not a military historian, and it is those stories of people, and because there are so many things that connect us rather than divide us. I had the great pleasure years ago to work with the History Museum on a project they did on Through the Eyes of a Child, and it looked at 4 historically Black communities in St. Louis. And that's when it really opened my eyes. I thought, am I qualified to be doing this as a white historian? But through that project, it connected me more for those shared stories. We recently did a teacher workshop that Vivian participated in, and also Amanda Clark from the History Museum, to share with teachers these stories too, so that they can share with their students. So that's what I love, sharing those stories and feeling connected.
Certainly family, history. To be erased is a powerful motivator. And I think that's the case in a lot of African American history in communities around our country, is that the stories have been suppressed and simply not told. And had I not written this book, it could very easily be that Mill Creek would have just been erased, because I'm in my 70s and people are in their 80s and 90s. Once we're gone, if nobody's talking about Mill Creek, nobody will know. And I hear that all the time. I didn't know. Where was it? And I'm amazed that it was the heart of downtown, and people are saying to me today they've never heard of it.
And there was, I think, an anecdote that you had shared with our producer, Maya Norfleet, about where a cousin lived, and that what is there now
is a parking lot, just a surface parking lot, a fence and asphalt.
Right. So, I mean, that the juxtaposition of where people lived and what is now no longer there is extremely powerful. Cicely, what is it about history that makes you feel more alive or attached to life now?
So for me, it's being able to understand how the past reflects the future. And, historians have talked about how, in order to understand the present moment, you have to be able to look back from where you came, right? And I think that that's what history allows me to do. It allows me to see what's happening in our present moment, but also thinking in the long term about, well, what does that mean for our young people that are to come, generations to come, long and, far beyond when I'm gone. What is it going to look like for our young people in the future? And I think that's what motivates me, is being able to see that through line that exists.
Do you think that people are a little bit more interested in history now personally? I mean, one of the things that we got from that engagement call out was from someone named Corey Hinton, and he tweeted that learning about Black history in particular, said, for me, it started with first grade with coloring sheets on Tubman, Truth, Henson, and King. And while I might have had teachers delve into it in units outside February, it wasn't until college where I took classes to fulfill a Black Studies minor. So that is another level of commitment, certainly. There's so much left out of the U.S. history books. Court, thank you for sharing those thoughts. And again, to this point about interest in history, do you think that there is more interest in history maybe now than a few years ago?
I think it's easier to research history now. You spoke earlier about 7th grade history. When I was in 7th grade, Black history was George Washington Carver, period. I didn't study African American history until college, and we were fighting for that. I was in college in 1967, and we boycotted to get African American studies courses, so you can all thank me.
Well, and that paved the way to fight for a lot of different Americans' experience
Yes.
and history, right? Where do you think we are headed? So, Cicely, knowing what we know now, what expectations do you have for the way Black history should be interpreted in the future?
I think that we're definitely moving in the right direction. That, as I spoke about earlier with my first comment, reading against the archive, that's where the work lies. And also the lived experience is also important to consider. So I think we're heading in the right direction. We just got to keep working it.
That's Cicely Hunter, public historian for the African American History Initiative at the Missouri Historical Society, Vivian Gibson, author of the memoir The Last Children of Mill Creek, and Pam Sanfilippo, program manager of Museum Services and Interpretation at the Gateway Arch National Park. They joined me to talk about the interpretation of Black history in February 2023. Coming up, we'll talk about how the Trump administration is changing how history is shown at some National Park Service sites across the country. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. 4.5 months ago, the Old Courthouse reopened to the public after extensive renovations. The legacy of that building is forever tied to Dred and Harriet Scott, two enslaved people who sued for their freedom in St. Louis. Their case made it to the U.S. Supreme Court when the justices in 1857 ruled that African Americans were not citizens and could not sue in federal court. The famous ruling preserved slavery and pushed the country closer to civil war. Earlier in the show, I mentioned that the Trump administration ordered several National Park Service sites to remove materials related to slavery and Native Americans. To talk about whether that's happening at Gateway Arch National Park in St. Louis, I'm joined by St. Louis on the Air executive producer, Alex Heuer. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Elaine.
Now, before we get into the specifics of St. Louis, what's happening at other National Park Service sites around the country?
Sure, and this is based on reporting from the New York Times, the Washington Post, as well as NPR, and I'll give 3 examples. The first is at Fort Pulaski National Monument in Georgia. The Trump administration directed the Park Service staff to remove a reproduction of the scourged back. That's a famous photo of a former enslaved man, and you see his back and the scars on it that were caused from when he was whipped as an enslaved person. That was one. And I should point out that the Interior Department later told The Hill publication that the Trump administration did not direct that. So it seems to be some disagreements about what is actually happening. Mm-hmm. But another example is at Manassas National Battlefield Park in Virginia. The Trump administration instructed park employees to take down a sign that criticizes the post-Civil War lost cause ideology. And the lost cause ideology is one that instead of emphasizing slavery as the proximate cause for the Civil War, talked about the Civil War being a noble cause by the South, and it provided this romanticized view of it and said that it was primarily based on states' rights. But the problem with that reasoning is that if it was based on states' rights, it was the right of states to preserve slavery. Mm-hmm. So the Manassas National Battlefield Park points out that that is not a good reason to talk about the Civil War. And then the third is at Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia. In a new upcoming exhibit about George Washington, there's a memorial to nine enslaved men and women that George Washington had that he chose to take with him to Washington that were deliberately rotated so that they could prevent them from gaining their freedom under Pennsylvania law. So the Trump administration asked that that be removed as well.
Mm-hmm. So coming closer to home here, what is going on, Alex, at Gateway Arch National Park?
I reached out to the Gateway Arch National Park staff, and they declined to comment.
So then you decided to go and check out the museums for yourself just the other day. What did you see?
Yeah, so just yesterday I was like, well, I'll just go and check it out for myself. And so I first stopped by the Old Courthouse, and as you mentioned in your introduction, that opened to the public after being closed for 5 years on May 3rd, I think it was. And the short answer is that at both sites, both the Old Courthouse, which is part of the park, and the museum underneath the arch, I can't tell anything that's happening. And based on what some of the contacts in our newsroom, it seems that St. Louis is really flying under the radar at the moment, at least. But in terms of the way that the Old Courthouse talks about slavery, I mean, you cannot tell the story of the Old Courthouse without talking about slavery. You talked about Dred and Harriet Scott, who sued for their freedom, but there were some 300 other freedom suits that happened there. But just for example, they do a good job at telling this story of slavery. They talk about how 12 million Africans were forcibly taken across the Atlantic and forced into servitude. 450,000 of those were brought to the British colonies, including what became the United States. They talk about the lack of justice for enslaved people who were murdered, and their murderers were never held to account. There is a model of iron shackles. There is a description of an enslaved woman crawling out of a house dragging chains. So it tells a very vivid picture of slavery, but it's the truth.
Mm-hmm. Are there other kinds of references to slavery there?
Well, sure. The court case, it describes the 5 court cases that involved Dred and Harriet Scott. Pam Sanfilippo, who we heard from earlier in the show, talked about how it really centers the human experience now. Lynn Jackson is the great-great-granddaughter of Dred and Harriet Scott. She's been on this show before, and so it's really a human-centered approach, but it also does tell the court story of the trials.
Mm-hmm. And you visited the courthouse before this renovation. You visited, I think, maybe as a child.
Oh, sure.
How does it compare?
Well, it's much better now, and it's just much nicer, but it tells a more complete human-centered picture.
Mm-hmm. You also went to the museum that is under the Gateway Arch. What did you see there, Alex?
Yeah, well, it's a great museum as well. I'll focus on the Native American part of this because the Trump administration has ordered several of those depictions to be taken down elsewhere. But in this museum, again, it tells the story well, but it presents different viewpoints, such as the West was won or the West was stolen. So those are very different viewpoints of the way that it interpreted. And in terms of President Thomas Jefferson's westward expansion, there's a panel that says, quote, "The problem with Jefferson's concept was that it viewed the West as an empty place to be filled by Anglo-Americans, when, in fact, it was already inhabited by a vast number of American Indian tribes as well as French and Spanish settlers." So it is not trying to just gloss over things. It's telling a real history.
Mm-hmm. While you were there, and understanding that you were there during the daytime, right, on a weekday, did you notice what people were doing in there? How were they interacting with what was in the museum?
I'd describe it as a typical museum crowd, and to be fair, I did a very quick scan through the museums. It pained me to only spend an hour in both of these museums, but I did notice as part of the executive order in March that Trump passed that they have these signs across both sites of the museum with a QR code and a website that encourages people to let the National Park Service or the Interior Department know if they, and I have the quote right here, if there are any signs or other information that are negative about either past or living Americans or that fail to emphasize the beauty, grandeur, and abundance of landscapes and other natural features, it's asking the public to let them know about that at parks.
Mm-hmm. And that is the inappropriately disparaging Americans past or living?
Right, as part of what the order in March was.
Mm-hmm. Now, St. Louisan and Mill Creek memoirist Vivian Gibson spoke to wanting to humanize history, and you've also mentioned that there was a comment made by Pam Sanfilippo about that too. What is your takeaway about what is at the Gateway Arch National Park and what it offers with regard to humanization of history?
Well, I think it's a story worth telling. I think history is best told when we're talking about the people who lived it. And it would be a shame if that history was covered up and that people weren't able to have an opportunity to see it because all of what happens from now on, our history underpins it. And we can only become a better place to live if we have an understanding of that history.
Mm-hmm. Alex Heuer is executive producer of this program. Alex, thanks so much for making that trip yesterday and for joining us today.
Thanks, Elaine.
Today's episode was produced by our executive producer, Alex Heuer.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.